An amazing guest with us this evening, Peter Lovatt. I'll introduce him in a second. The dance doctor, as he's styled, a psychologist with special interest in movement and dance. And he has a very interesting stuff to tell us about that. Just before we jump into saying hi to him, just a reminder, this is the live show. If you're listening to this on the 7th of July at 9 o'clock UK time, this is live and direct, and it'd be lovely to have your contributions. You can drop me a WhatsApp on my number, which is +44 7506 319 745, or on one of the platforms we're streaming on, which is my YouTube channel, my LinkedIn profile, and also my Facebook page. So any one of those, drop a message. If James manages to stay awake, he might even look at the messages and pass them on to me, but you never know. He's a young lad. He needs his sleep. I think we have him up past his usual bedtime, but maybe he'll stay awake for us, who knows. Anyway, enough of that. On to Peter Lovatt, Dr. Peter Lovatt. Wonderful to have you. And I need to apologise on air because I had Peter booked some time ago, and then something happened in my life. I can't remember what it was, but something happened, and that meant I had to cancel the show. But Peter has been very kind and very generous in coming back in to see us. So thank you for that, Peter. Apologies for the initial sort of cancellation, and it's really good to have you back. And how are you?
Well, I'm very good, thanks. And first of all, thanks very much for inviting me back. I mean, I'm delighted to be here, and lovely to chat with you today.
Yeah, good. I'm really looking forward to it. So where are you based? You're in the UK, I presume.
I'm in the UK. I'm in North Norfolk, and I think it's the only place in the country today where it's not sunny. And in North Norfolk coast. It's lovely up here.
It is. I've been up that part of the world. I really like it. I've cycled around there a lot, actually. It's a very nice part of the world, surprisingly, because it only used to be known for turkeys at one point.
Well, now they've progressed to crabs now. So we've got chroma crabs.
I actually saw Bernard's farm once on one of my cycle tours. I actually sort of ended up cycling past it, which was quite exciting for me. For the youngsters, they won't know what I'm talking about, but Bernard Matthews had a turkey farm, and he was based in Norfolk, and he used to have these really sort of rusty adverts. They were very rusty and creaky sort of things. And have you always been in Norfolk? Is that your...
Oh, no. We've only been here for 7.5 years now. And so Lindsay, who's my wife, and I, we had a child very late. And we had been living near St Albans, just outside London. Yeah. And we thought, let's move on somewhere. We always had this great plan that when our first son got to 18, we'd sell our house in St Albans area, and we'd go and live in it in the middle of the West End in a little tiny box, just me and Lindsay in a little tiny box, and that would be fantastic. And then, of course, when our son was 15, then Lindsay got pregnant again, and we went, oh! And then we realized we couldn't do that. So we thought the next best thing, why don't we move to the coast?
Yeah.
And so we moved out to the coast, and we live out here now, which is lovely.
How old's your second son now?
Oh, he's now 10.
Right. So the other one's flown the coop, obviously. He was in his 20s.
Completely. When he was 16, he'd flown the coop. He's a musician. And so he was off playing music and doing his own thing. But yeah, exactly. He's gone.
Great stuff. And the other one, how's he doing? Is he happy sort of getting...
Oh, he loves it. I mean, living by the coast and growing up by the coast means his after school club is going surfing. So yeah, he loves all that.
That's horrible. What a terrible thing to do to him. We should phone social services now and have him snatched from you. And your wife, Lindsay, is also in therapies as well, isn't she?
Yeah, she was. She was a therapy lead up here in Norfolk for several years. And now we work together running we work in dance and mental well-being. So that's our core business now. Yeah. And
we're going to get onto your websites and the services. I'm interested, you started off in the arts, didn't you, like me? We look a similar generation. I think you look a little bit younger than me, a bit more sprightly. but reasonably similar generation by the looks of it. So you got into dance and theatre, sort of musical theatre, really, I suppose.
Yeah, dancing. For me, dancing was the thing. So I started off as a dancer. I mean, every single human being starts life as a dancer. We're all dancers. And for me, that
you might be able to answer this. I'm sort of, because I know music is a prior to language, and musical appreciation starts in utero. Is dance similar?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. We know that if we have this sensory motor coupling. So even when really young babies, when you play some rhythms to them, they don't entrain perfectly, but they move in response to this rhythm. And we know that even 2-day-old babies have an expectation of rhythmic patterns. There was one study looking at 3-day-old babies, and they put headphones on them, and they measured their brain activity, and they played certain rhythms to them. And then they took some beats out of the rhythms, and then they wanted to see whether the baby's brain would respond to the missing beats. And they did, such that the babies were obviously expecting this rhythm. But when the rhythm was distorted in some way, the baby's brain responded. There was a negative response, which they could measure that response, which is extraordinary.
Wow.
So we know that kids, we know that kids are born to perceive rhythm. And then once you perceive that rhythm, I mean, of course, then the rest of it, the sensory motor coupling that comes in, and the shaking in response to the music, and the smiling that happens when people hear music and they move to it, is fabulous. So
let's talk about this sensory motor stuff, because I think it's really important. People don't understand how important that is in terms of neurological development, and the link between physical movement and neurological development, which of course is really, really important for babies. So newborn babies, just a bit of information for people. There are these really quite tragic and informative brain scans of severely neglected babies and babies have been normally interacted with. And literally, the brain scans of the severely neglected children show big holes in the frontal lobes, because without appropriate types of stimulation, the frontal lobes, the brain just doesn't develop in babies. And this sort of new sensory motor neural couplings that you're talking about, I think is really, really important for people to understand. Would you mind talking to me? Because you know about this stuff far more than me. I mean, you studied it sort of.
Well, we know that there's this link. So sensory motor coupling, we have sensory information coming in, and it could be sensory information from any modality that comes in, and it stimulates the premotor cortex. So the sense of, so before the movement happens, you get that stimulation there.
Yeah.
And then eventually you stimulate the motor cortex, and the motor cortex then leads to a physical external movement or a desire to move. So some of this sensory motor coupling is called the psychology of groove, because being in the groove is that notion of sensory information coming in. And what we know is that, so all kids have this, and we see little tiny children moving in response to auditory stimulation. Now, of course, you might be saying, well, I don't respond to that, I'm not. But you will, because the startle reflex is at the root of this sensory motor coupling, where you go, something happens and you jump. This is your sensory motor coupling in action. And of course, it underpins a whole range of things. It's not just about us responding to music. It's about responding to speech as well. So you're responding to other people speaking to you. And it's not just the auditory aspect of speech. You're also responding to the visual elements of speech. So looking at your carer's eyes, feeding with your mother. There's a whole range of those sensory things that are happening, which stimulate that neural activity and help that neural development that you're talking about. Yeah. So this is why really rich social environments are so good for people. Now, of course, we understand at the other end of the life scale, when we end up with things like dementia, we know that there's a relationship between the richness of people's social networks and the probability of the onset of dementia, such that those people who have broader social networks and are more integrated social networks are less likely to develop some of the symptoms of dementia. Yeah. Well, exactly the same is true with children at the other end as the brain is developing, such that when we get that social interaction between people, it stimulates that neural development. But then also we've got the movement element as well. So if you think about the kind of movements that you do and the interaction you have with other people through movement, that of course is really important too. Now, there was a recent paper that was looking at and this paper only came out a few months ago, maybe even last month it was, but looking at the motor strip, right? So you've got this motor strip inside the brain where you've got this kind of drawing of a homunculus of a big hand, representing one part of the motor strip, and the lips and another part, and your body and the whole range. And what these researchers found was that in between, down that motor strip, within that, there were then connections which come through to the frontal lobe and which stimulate cognitive processing and stimulating executive function. And so the relationship between movement and the stimulation in other areas of the brain is really, really, really important.
Yeah.
So, of course, we know the story of that tragic young girl, I think her name was Jeannie, maybe, who was sat in California.
Was she autistic? Was she just neglected? Yeah, absolutely. It's a dreadful story, but
absolutely dreadful.
Yeah.
But so she sat in a chair and deprived of all kinds of sensory information and deprived of movement as well. But then think about that also in a classroom. When we restrict a young child from moving in a classroom, we're cutting out half of their learning experiences for them. Yeah, and absolutely. When we're sitting in an office all day long in our computer, we're restricting our cognitive abilities by our lack of movement. So it's really important that we keep moving throughout life for a healthy brain, for the developer of brain at a young age, to keep and maintain a healthy brain during adulthood and teenage years, adulthood, later life. And then as we go into the final part of our lives, then movement is really important for some of those aspects to do with dementia, or at least mild cognitive impairment.
Yeah, and movement as well is also linked, isn't it, to, just for people that don't know, it's this process called myelination, which is how structure is formed in the brain. Okay, so, and the way I tend to explain it is, if you think about just a cable like this, we know inside that cable there are thin metal filaments, and the myelination is, if you like, the plastic that's wrapped around this cable. And what that does is it means that the electric signal can move more efficiently without distortion. And myelination does a similar thing to electrical sort of chemical signals in the brain. And those structures are crucial to everything that we do, the executive function that you're talking about, the sense of self, the language, etc. And all of this is really intimately connected to movement. And it goes back, if you go back in time in human culture, we were hunter-gatherers, we moved all the time. And this was fundamentally how we learned. And in other social cultures, a lot of the encoding of knowledge is in these dances and these movements and these rituals. Yeah. And that's how knowledge is transmitted, right?
Absolutely. There are some cases of people transmitting, I forgot whereabouts in the world it was, but it was a place where there were very high levels or very low levels of literacy. Yeah. So communities where people couldn't read. And midwives were carrying stories about the process of birth through dances and movement, and communicating really important, vital information through movement patterns and through shared movement and storytelling through
dance has a really central part in this, because if you think about Indian classical dance, for example, it's like sign language. I remember it was really interesting because I know sign language. I'm not great at it anymore, but I learned it some time ago. And sign language is obviously a movement-based language. It's a visual movement-based language. It was an ex-partner of mine who was trained as a classical Indian dancer, and I hadn't seen her dance. And then I saw her dance, and I could tell what she was actually just telling a story about going to the river and washing clothes. Mm-hmm. And I could tell that from watching the dance because of my sign language background. It was fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
What's really, really interesting, I find, so you have these representational dance languages where you might have a crown on your head and you can have a certain gesture. So you get a gestural form of dance where there's a relationship between a meaning and a movement. But we've also found that even in contemporary dance, where you break away from those explicit meanings, people can still communicate meanings, even through abstract movements. So we did a show years ago called 23 Feelings in Dance. And we invited choreographers to come in and to create a piece of movement based around certain words and feelings and emotions to see how dancers really communicated ideas through movement. And it had to be a 3-minute piece of dance. And we had people who were representing a wide range of emotional states. So it wasn't like happy, sad, it was much more subtle than that. And it was, richness of complexes of emotions. And we then asked the audience what was being communicated.
Wow, I'd
and the
love to
audience
be
could
there for
get
that.
it.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, it was amazing. We had one story of and it was this dance maker had made the piece on a female dancer, and it was about pregnancy loss, and about the emotional aspect of pregnancy loss. And about 3 or 4 days before the show, her female dancer became unavailable. And so it was then converted onto a man, and a man danced this piece.
Wow.
And it wasn't representation. He wasn't,
Yeah.
he was dancing the emotions of what it would feel like to lose a pregnancy. And then we asked the audience what was happening. And it was really interesting because people in the audience were making gestures going, I don't know, it just seemed to be about loss. There seemed to be loss happening. And they'd be making these and they were creating gestures around loss, but these were not gestures that the dancer had been using in the performance. And it was amazing that dancers or the audience could still pick up the meaning behind these movements, even when it was abstract contemporary dance.
It's so interesting because I remember going to see Matisse at the Tate, and I'd only ever seen prints of the dancers and stuff. I'd never seen the actual cutouts and stuff like that. And I remember going into one of the rooms and just crying. And I was like, what? And I just started crying. And I didn't. And Matisse, of course, is classically known as an artist who communicates emotion. But I'd seen his pictures in books, and I was like, yeah, what's all that about? But I don't feel anything. But I went into this room with all this stuff, and I started weeping, literally weeping really deeply. And I didn't know what it was going on. I went and read what it was, and it was actually just a collection of his final paintings before he died. And they just decided to put those all into a room. And I'd read his grief, and they had communicated. And that is really strange, because nothing in it was representational. Nothing said, this is me on my bed dying. He just somehow captured that experience he was having and communicated it in the form, which hints at, and I don't know what you think about this, it hints at this suggestion that something in the arts, in dance and music and the visual arts, is transcultural, it's passed on. This is going to sound a bit woo-woo, and I don't want it to sound woo-woo. How do we explain that, Peter? How do we explain those types of phenomena?
Well, I believe that dancing and music and the arts, the way we express art through making marks on things, I think humans are born to do those things. They are innate activities. They are as innate as us breathing, as us breeding, finding a mate, copulating, falling in love with another person. All of those things are run across all cultures. They're so fundamental to what it is to be a human being that they run across all of those cultures. And in many ways, what gets in the way, our culture gets in the way of us expressing those things. So we see all of those things in really in young children, and they're there. And then our culture seems to create an environment where it squeezes us and prevents us. I have people coming to me who say, I would love to dance, but I can't dance. And my view is that everyone can dance. We're all breathing. We all have a heartbeat. If you're breathing and you've got a heartbeat, then you can dance, and you are dancing. And but what stops you from dancing is the anxiety, and there's a whole range of social constraints around it about being the wrong person to do it. Yeah. So I think those fundamental acts are fundamentally important to our human development as well.
Yeah.
I think it's a real shame that we de-emphasize those within the education system.
And I guess that's part of your work, is encouraging people to do that, which we're going to come to. I want to go back a little bit, because I got off on a tangent that's interesting to me, because I know you have this knowledge base, and so I'm really happy to have you here and talking about it. But I started asking you about how you started your career, and you started out in the arts yourself. What informed that choice for you to go and train in theatre and in musical theatre and go along that route? Was that something like your family embraced it and went, oh, he's going to be a dancer, how exciting?
No, I was a dancer. As a kid, we had a bedroom. We lived in St Albans. We lived in this house on the big main road. And I used to, in the winter, it'd be dark outside. I'd put the lights on inside the bedroom, and then suddenly there'd be a mirror, and I would just dance. And I was dancing. Really? And dancing has always been my sort of, happy, contented place. From being at primary school, dancing was the thing that made me smile and made my heart skip. And the act of dancing and moving to rhythmic movement disco dancing, when that 1970s music came in, it was like, oh yeah. It was just me. And then when I went to school, I went to a normal secondary school, and I hated school. I mean, I've never hated anything more in my life than hating school. It was such a sterile, horrible environment. And I struggled with everything associated with being in school. But the school had a dance group, and I joined the school dance group. And for a while, I was the only boy in it. And when I danced, the world felt different. You know, my emotions were different. My relationships with other people were different. My thinking, I didn't feel like a useless failure. I felt like I could do something.
Yeah.
And so for me, dancing was just, and of course, being at it was a comprehensive school in St Albans in the 1970s, and being a male dancer, you can imagine you just get.
I can't imagine. Names. In fact, I think there's a film has been made about it. Is it really about you, that film?
Well, it could have been. When it first came out, it was like, oh, hello, thankfully people are talking about this kind of thing.
I can imagine,
yeah. But during that thing where, you know, people would say whatever they liked. If they found a pair of ballet shoes in your bag, they could say whatever you liked.
You were done for.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
And so at one point I said to my dad, look, I'm going to stop dancing because the grief I'm getting. And my dad said to me, look, do you really want to kind of punch this bloke on the nose, metaphor? You know, and I said, well, yeah. And he said, well, keep dancing then. Just keep doing it. Why would you stop? His life. It's your life, and if you enjoy it, then you've got.
And your dad was supportive then. He wasn't, so they didn't put you down.
No. I mean, he couldn't quite. Well, my dad had all these sort of preoccupations, thinking that, you know, because I danced, it must say something about my sexuality, which of course in the 1970s was very, very different to our perception of, you know, we're in Pride Month now. Thankfully, we have this great celebration of everything, which is brilliant. But in the 1970s, it wasn't like that.
No.
And so a lot of the kind of verbal bullying I got was associated with sexual orientation and with sexual identity and gender identity.
Yeah.
And, you know, and even my dad would say things that were homophobic and, you know, about me dancing.
It was normal in those days, wasn't it? I mean, it was. Still is normal at times and these days, but thankfully things have changed quite a lot, and we know it's homophobic. It wouldn't have even been thought of as homophobic, to be honest. They would have just been thought as normal. This is what you say, isn't it? But
yeah,
did you sort of question those issues, or was it for you?
Yeah, of course I questioned it. I mean, what was really interesting about that experience was when it's interesting about your identity, isn't it? About who you are as a human being. And when people tell you who you are often enough, then it's very easy for you to become that identity. You know, if somebody says that you're stupid often enough, you'll believe you're stupid, you'll be the stupid one. If someone tells you you're the brave one, you'll be the brave one. If someone tells you something else. And so with regards to sexuality, I questioned it a great deal. I kept thinking, gosh, is it my identity? Is this my, you know? And I questioned it, and I questioned it, and I questioned it, and I came to the conclusion that wasn't my sexual identity.
Frankly sad, I think. I've got to do some radio interviews over the next few days because it's Men's Mental Health Week. And not many people know that, but it is. So I'm on the BBC quite a lot on radio. I've got one tomorrow talking about it. And it's sort of this thing of like, there is this gender difference in the response to dance and movement, for example. And you are correct in saying this is a fundamental transcultural human experience. It's fundamental to mental health, without a doubt. Without a doubt. There is like a load of evidence the size of Mount Everest to support what you're saying, right? That's it. It's not even debatable anymore. And it's like the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. Movement is important for mental health and brain health and etc. So, and it's profoundly sad that we have a culture that is so distorted that men would feel uncomfortable about using something that is profoundly necessary for emotional, cultural, relational, and psychological health. It's tragic, you know, it's absolutely tragic. And I think some of those issues still exist, you know.
They do. I was doing a TV show a couple of years ago where we went to a northern town and worked with some rugby players and to see whether we could use dance to help them become better rugby players.
Yeah.
So that was the premise.
Which you could, without a doubt.
Oh, yeah, and it does.
Without a doubt. Do you remember Fame? Do you remember that show, Fame?
Of course.
My favourite show. It must have been both of our favourite shows. The same time, I'm going to this, you're going to dance. And do you remember when the American football players come on? And the dancers versus the American football players, and the dancers kick the asses of the American football players, as we knew they would.
Well, with that context, bear in mind, I took the manager of this rugby team to a ballet school to meet some male ballet dancers, and I took the winger and I took the manager. And before we went in, I said to the manager, "Have you ever been to a ballet school before?" He said, "No." I said, "What are you expecting?" And he said, "Lesser men." And I said, "What do you mean lesser men?" What? He said, homosexual. And that was his. And it was. This is only a few years ago. This wasn't in the 1980s. This was a couple of years ago. Wow. And you have this attitude still of that whole exchange of what you're expecting, lesser men. What do you mean by lesser men? Homosexual, because they dance. Yeah. And it was just an extraordinary realization that we've moved on a huge amount in 50 years, but we haven't moved that far because people still have these societal impressions.
Please tell me that when they saw the guys dancing, they were blown away, because ballet in particular is the pinnacle. And the physical fitness involved in ballet, I mean, it's distorted stuff. I mean, it's actually, there's problems with it in the field. But
well, even so, ballet, right? So I've had the pleasure of working on Strictly Come Dancing, It Takes Two. And when I went into the green room of It Takes Two, there were photographs of six packs everywhere. And there was a competition between the celebrities and the male dancers about who had the best six pack of the guys. No. And the dancers always won. So these are the ballroom dancers. These ballroom dancers are as fit, or if not fitter, than the elite athletes who go on the show.
Dancer I've ever met is solid. They are solid. Yeah. That's the whole point about it.
They are solid, and they are strong, and they are masculine. But what's even more amazing, there's this other research which shows that there's a link between people's testosterone levels and the way they dance. Such that higher testosterone men dance in a way that other people find more attractive, more masculine, and more dominant. And so those positive aspects of dancing are associated with high levels of testosterone in men. And of course, it's those high testosterone men who are in the Premier League footballers. They're the people who earn the most money in the city. Yeah. They get the front row seats in orchestras. These are the guys that we aspire to be like. And they're the ones who their testosterone is related to their dancing, in just kind of a funky groove, and other people find them more masculine. So this whole sense that dancing relates to being effeminate is completely counter to the science, this is what I find that link so extraordinary, that our perception is entirely different to the reality, and yet it's almost impossible to change the perception.
Yeah, it's very strange. Is that a sort of general cultural thing as well? Is that sort of level of distortion true across other cultures? Is it very much our time?
No. I mean, Northern European cultures, it's really prevalent. I do a lot of talks I was talking in Munich last week, or the week before, and I was at the BMW Center in Munich doing an event for business people. Right. And before I went on at lunchtime, I was talking to the compere, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to have the audience dancing this afternoon." And he said, "No way." He said, "No, this is a German audience. German men will not dance." And they did, of course. They did dance. But the perception was that German men will not dance. And there was an absolute certainty associated with that impression that this guy had as a compere. And you think, wow, this is
it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Coming back, so you go into musical theatre. We went off another tangent, but I love these tangents. We're going to keep going off of them. It's fine. Okay. You went into musical theatre after having had these, challenging experiences in the 70s growing up and questioning who you were and what you were. But you persisted. You trained. Where did you train again?
I trained at the Guildford School of Acting, so GSA.
Okay. And then you went out and you got work. And what, you were in the West End or something like that? And
No, I was in, I did touring musical theatre. So I toured the #1 theatres in the UK. And then I went and worked on a cruise ship as a dancer.
right.
And I did panto. So I was doing panto at now this dates it. So for anybody watching this, I was in Aladdin at the Richmond Theatre. And in that year, Anita Dobson, she was the leading lady in the show. She was playing Aladdin, and that was the year that Dirty Den served her divorce papers on Christmas Day with the turkey. And so we had this press pack outside the theatre going, oh my word, Anita's been served, Angie Watts, of course, she was playing in EastEnders at the time. Absolutely. So that dates it really. That was
wow. So you did sort of essentially repertory type theatre. You moved around the country touring and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which is sadly, there's not that much of it left anymore, is it? It's sort of moved on. And how long did you do that for, Peter?
I did that for, I did it for 3 or 4 years after drama school. So I left drama school at 21. And then when I was 23, that's when I was doing the panto, I then overcame a very severe reading difficulty. And up until then, reading had been inaccessible to me. And I had this moment of change. I was on stage at the Richmond Theatre and we're in rehearsal at the time. And I had this belief change. I always believed that I was fundamentally stupid and incapable of learning the written word because I hadn't learned anything. I'd failed my exams over and over again. And because of my dance, I had this belief change that suddenly I thought, gosh, no, I'm not stupid. I'm not stupid. If I'm capable of learning all these different movement patterns and I can learn different dance routines and execute them in the way that everybody else can, I thought, well, I must then be capable of learning to read and write. So I carried on working in theatre while I learned to read and write. And then once that happened, it took a couple of years, I then did an A-level in psychology. I got a D in. I was my delightful D. I was absolutely delighted with my D.
You must have been over the moon to get any sort of course.
Oh my word. Oh my God. Yeah, completely. And then I applied for university and they all said no. And then the next year I did an A-level in English and I failed the A-level in English. But fortunately, while I was failing the A-level in English, somebody gave me an offer of a place at a university on the basis of my delightful D. I think they thought I might have passed the A-level in English. So I went then to university to study psychology and English.
Right.
And
when I come back, before you get into that bit of your career, when I come back, because I think you've made a really important point about the arts. So we have this weight of educational cultural expectations, which you could not meet, but you could be successful in the arts.
Yeah.
And I think that's really vital. I mean, that's been my experience of working with people for decades now. It's that being successful in the arts doesn't require, I guess, because it's so fundamental to human experience, it's available to all of us. This transcultural sort of artistic engagement, whether it be theatre, movement, music, visual arts, etc., is just available innately as human beings. And therefore, if I'm a human being, I can do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that allowed you to survive in actually quite a hostile environment, Peter. It was homophobic. It made you question yourself. It began to take away your self-esteem. But there was a core of you was able to survive because of this capacity you had to dance. Would that be reasonable to say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely spot on. Yes.
That sort of saved you, really, didn't it? And that's a story I'm very, very familiar with. For people for many, many, many years now have come up with similar stories like that they've been able to fall back on these things, which have then allowed them the time they needed to acquire the other skills which are necessary. Right, carry on.
But isn't it dreadful that we perceive it as a falling back, as something lesser? Why are we thinking of that as being something lesser than learning to read and write? And why isn't it equal to it? Because if it's equal to it, then it could be a springboard for us to leap forward. Yeah. And we don't have, now there's 2 points of here. One is that I'm very lucky that I learned to read and write, and I then went on to loads of degrees, and so I had that career path. But if I'd had a career purely in the arts without ever having learned to read and write, that is just as valuable, maybe even more valuable than the route I took. So I don't think we should always call it. I get lots of emails from people saying, I love to dance, but I'm also really good at the sciences. should I go to university or should I dance? And I think, well, a lot of people don't have that choice, but people seem to think that the science route is somehow more valuable. It's more valued by society.
I'll tell you how it worked for me, because I told you before the show, I have background in theatre and the arts myself, and I made a living at it, which is unusual. So as you know, sort of like, I managed to pay the rent with it, which was pretty impressive. But what happened to me was that I was listened to the voices that said, no, it's really important that you go to university and get a degree, and then you can do the arts, because you won't be able to make a living at it. Actually, I went to university and I bombed out. It was a dreadful decision as an undergraduate. And what was left was my capacity to be an actor. Yeah. And that's what saved my arse, to be honest. Without that, I don't know. I sort of genuinely don't think I'd be here, to be honest. But I was able to have that. And like you say, a lot of people don't have that opportunity. But what happened to me during that 10 years was I came to an understanding that artistic endeavor is central to human experience. Yeah. And it became unequivocal to me that that is the truth, and that artistic endeavour, whatever we define that as, and it doesn't have to be at the Royal Albert Hall, it can be in your bath. In fact, I used to run an a cappella singing evening in a local bar called Singing in the Bath, where people got up and sang for the first time in public, people who'd only sung in the shower or the bath. And it was an extraordinary moment. Like you can imagine a drama involved in that one. But I became fundamentally, that's why I trained. So coming back to you, not me, I was like, this so fascinating to me because there's so many points of similarity in our story. But so you then train as a psychologist, you sort of soak up all this knowledge and these qualifications. Tell us about that bit of your journey.
Yeah, so I did my, I did my first degree in psychology and English. And then I was very lucky to get a scholarship to do a master's degree in neural computation, which is mathematical modeling of brain functions. Yeah. And then I got another scholarship after that to do my PhD in experimental cognitive psychology. So looking at language and memory systems in the brain and seeing how they work. So I was originally interested in neurodegeneration and what happens after or brain injury. How does that brain injury impact memory and language, and how do those functions come back again after injury? And then, so I was doing all of that stuff, and I loved that for a while. I loved all the learning, but then I fundamentally missed dancing. Yeah. And I just had this, I really felt, I've had a few periods of my life where I've had, mental well-being as being very low. And one of those was when I was sat in my office at university thinking, oh my word, I'm a cognitive psychologist. What on earth am I doing? I want to be on stage. I want to be somewhere else. I want to be, what? I'll be reading a paper on reintegration in short-term memory that 3 other people might be interested in. Yeah. And so I wanted then to come back into theatre and come back on to use dance and find ways. So I thought at that point I'd have to leave academia and go back into theatre again. So I played around, I flirted with that idea of, so I auditioned for things like the Blue Man Group. I was this 40-year-old, I was flabby.
I'd actually love to work for them, to be honest. I'd love to work with them. It's fantastic stuff. Brilliant, genius.
Yeah. So there's a whole range of stuff. Then I thought, okay, I'm going to stay in academia. And then I spoke to my head of department at the University of Hertfordshire, and I said to him, look, I'm going to leave. He said, why are you leaving? And I said, well, because I want to go back into theatre. And he said, well, why don't you do that here? Why don't you combine that here? And he said, I'll give you some time out of your timetable. You can find yourself here. And so I started to do research into the psychology of performing arts. I thought I'd combine my science knowledge with the performing arts. And then that evolved into the psychology of dance. And the more I studied dance, I tried to understand dance from a scientific perspective. Did you know Ditty Doctor? Sorry?
You know Ditty Doctor?
No.
She was based at the University of Hertfordshire around about the same time.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Taught on the dance movement therapy. Yeah. She was a dance movement therapist. And the Leader Gersey was there, and Phil Jones was there, and people like that in the arts. Because that's where I trained as an arts therapist.
Ah, well, they closed down the dance department there just before I arrived there. And I arrived there in 2004. Yeah.
Your supervisor, so your boss said, right, let's combine the two, right? Okay.
Yeah, he said, do what you like. And so I combined the two together. And then And then it all changed. But one day the press got interested in what I was doing, and I was invited onto the Graham Norton show to talk about it. And then we started working with people with Parkinson's disease, looking at dance and movement and the impact it has on Parkinson's, all the time coming at it from a scientific perspective. And then I've been invited around the world to talk about this research, because people find it interesting that you can talk about a hard science subject, like neuroscience, through the medium of dance or involving dance, and people understanding that. And what I found is that I'm now much more often on stage and on TV as a function of being a scientist who dances.
You're more successful in performance as a scientist than you ever were. But it's an interesting combination as well. And I really like the idea of science and arts in combination. A good friend of mine is a science writer, and she writes for children. She makes science available in her books from children. And she has that capacity to combine those two things, which is really important when you communicate with children. As you know, it has to be done in a way that is fun and creative and interesting. When did you start to think, okay, right, I want to start turning this into services that I can give to people, and rather than just going to lectures and being on the television? When did you write, for example, your book, which is The Dance Cure?
Well, so The Dance Cure, being somebody who came to reading late, The Dance Cure took about 10 years to write. I've got on my computer about 15 different folders with different versions of the book with different titles. And that went round in circles for a long time due to confidence issues and a whole range of other issues. So what happened was, in 2018, I made a TV show with a dance called Darcy Bustle, and it was called Darcy Bustle Dancing to Happiness. And one of the lovely things about meeting Darcy and working with her on this TV show, I'd always been kind of passionate about thinking about research into dance. And as you yourself said earlier on, there's such a mountain of research evidence showing a positive impact between this and that. Of course, you do need more, but what we really need is, so when Darcy and I were together, we were going, well, okay, this is all great, but how can we apply this in the real world? You know, how can we take this out of the university and out of the dance studio and apply it in the real world? And so I then left the university and set up two organizations. One is called Movement in Practice. And Movement in Practice is all about how we apply the psychology of dance and movement in education, business, and in healthcare. So how do we find practical solutions in those real world situations to have people moving, to improve the human experience in those areas? And then as part of that, we were then, Lindsay, who's my wife, who's a therapist, we were thinking, well, how can we apply this particularly for dance? And then in 2021, so my book, The Dance Cure, came out in 2020, just when all the bookshops were closing. And so the Dance Cure, so it's called The Dance Cure, which is great. I like the title, it's all good. And then in January 2021, I was then diagnosed with stage 3 bowel cancer. And being stage 3, that diagnosis kind of just smacked me around the head 1,000 times. And one of the things in the book I write about is about how dance can help people overcome certain things. Now, I am not saying that dance cures cancer, because it does not. Right? I'm not saying that dance cures anything. It doesn't cure Parkinson's disease. It doesn't cure cancer. It doesn't cure any of those things. Right? It does not. When I got the cancer diagnosis, I had a great medical team looking after my physical body and the cancer and getting rid of the tumor, taking out all my lymph nodes and carrying on the treatment program. They did all that. But the work I had to do separately, for which dance was really important, was the work of my head. When I got the diagnosis and was going through the whole thing, there were 3 psychological things that completely floored me. One was my emotions. I'm quite a stable emotional person, and then my emotions were just bouncing like a rubber ball randomly all over the place. I go up, I come down. All day long, I'd say to my wife, I'm fine. How are you? She'd go, I'm fine too. And I go, yeah, I'm fine. I'm being positive. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. But it wasn't fine. My head, my emotions were all over the place. But I couldn't let that emotion out. And I would only cry. We went for a walk, or if I moved my body, but when I was on my own. And the second thing that happened was the catastrophizing. I'd try to be positive and optimistic. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'd have these horrible nightmares.
Yeah.
And during the day, we had our son at the time, our younger son at the time was he was nearly 8, he was 7 and a bit. And I went through all this catastrophizing, thinking about him growing up, about me not being there, and about what the future looked like. And then the third element was that Lindsay and I have been married for over 30 years, and we've been through all kinds of nonsense in our lives. Mm-hmm. And we've always had a really strong relationship, and we've always been really strong, in terms of our relationship. And it got to the point, because we spent so much time going, yeah, I'm fine, we weren't communicating with each other. So dance helped me in 3 ways. So first of all, dance helped me to control my emotional state. So I would do a ballet class, or I'd do a qigong class to connect my breathing and the movement to try to moderate my emotions. The second thing I'd do for the catastrophizing, every day I did a 20-minute 5, 6, 7 Broadway musical theatre with a glitter hat, the whole thing. And for 20 minutes every day, I'd imagine I was on a West End stage or a Broadway stage in a different musical. And that 20 minutes was so important to give my head space to go, for 20 minutes to take that shit away from it, that nightmare away. And then the third thing with Lindsay and I, we would just go, yeah, fine, you're fine, yeah, I'm fine, you fine, yeah, I'm fine. And we couldn't speak. We couldn't say what we were really feeling.
Yeah.
But when we held on to one another, like we were in a school disco, and we just moved, the communication between us, we didn't have to use words, because we'd know how each other felt.
And there's an overemphasis on cognitive processing of emotional material. I think partly cognitive behavioral therapy is to blame for that, and other therapies. But actually, if we can, the issue is about communicating what we're feeling. And it doesn't matter how we communicate it, but it does matter that we communicate it, and with another person who receives that communication, right? That's what was going on then. And it reminds me, there was really interesting stuff. Some colleagues of mine years ago during the Bosnian Wars went over to work with the kids that had been through some of those experiences. And the kids refused point blank to talk about any of their experiences, quite rightly so. Why would you willingly talk about that? You'd be bonkers to willingly want to talk about that stuff. But they were happy to paint it out, and they were happy to play around it in the sand train. They were happy to dance and move about it. And they would process in that way, in these sort of forms of communication that are these sort of primal, if you like, forms of communication that we have available. I love that story. I don't love the fact you went through it, but it's very generous of you to share it with us.
I found the social element of having cancer is so different from having a mental health condition.
Yeah.
If I'd had the mental health state without the cancer, then we wouldn't have had lasagnas left on our front doorstep, and we wouldn't have had the massive social support that we had.
Yeah.
But also the thing that really irritated me, I guess I shouldn't be unkind to people who were probably showing kindness, even people who really, 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 really don't like me would phone up, and I haven't spoken to them for 4 or 5 or 6 years. They would hear that I had cancer, and they'd be on the phone. And it's a bit like those therapists and counselors going into Bosnia and talking to kids who've been through trauma and wanting to hear their stories. It's like quite obscene, really, that you want to hear their stories. They don't belong to you. They're inside the person. And I found myself getting really irritated by these people who would phone up and they go, tell me how you're feeling. So, is this really bad? How's it feeling? Yes, exactly. Right. And the funny thing is, these people have never phoned me since. They hadn't phoned me.
I was telling you, wasn't I, about this story about a patient of mine who has these total strangers turning up, and the patient is responding in what I think is an appropriate way, which is to ignore them because they're total strangers. But the total strangers, because they have qualifications, can then say that's a sign they're ill. Yeah. I'm thinking it's not. It's not a sign at all. It's a sign that he's quite reasonably and rationally wanting you to piss off out of his bedroom and stop bothering him. It's sort of like...
Exactly.
He does have to deal as well, but that's not the diagnostic tool, and that's not the diagnostic criteria. But that's, I guess, to come back to this point about this social stuff, which is again a point that you've been making again and again and again, that that what we need to be doing is re-engaging socially with each other, and not just, and I think that's the important thing about what you're describing to me, is that this is tapping into broad cultural, social patterns and experiences and needs. And in a sense, it brings us from quite disturbed, isolated, fragmented states into something that is fundamental to human experience and broader. And I'm intrigued by that. I'm also intrigued by something you said earlier on about people getting emotional meaning from stuff, even when it's not pictorial, when it's not trying to be representation, and again, finding connection.
Yeah.
And that's fundamental to me, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fundamental to human societies, that shared movement. And one of the things we lost during lockdown was that ability to share space and share movement. I don't mean in a formal dance way, but just to move around people and to be around people. Because of the communication that happens, the implicit communication as well as the explicit communication that's going on.
What do you think about things? Because I got quite ill during the lockdown. I became quite obese, and my own mental health struggles that I've had much of my life that come and go, and I have ups and downs. They became quite severe during that. And one of the things I chose to do without thinking about it was to join yoga classes at the first opportunity. And there's been something extraordinarily healing for me about being around other people in these ritualized physical movements, which I can, as a bloke, I'll go, it's just calisthenics, but it's not. It's more than just calisthenics. It's a shared meaning and purpose and passion. It's movement-based, it's breathing-based. And what would be your sort of take on those types of experiences?
Oh, absolutely. I think it doesn't matter what they're called. It doesn't matter whether you call it yoga or calisthenics. It doesn't matter. It's shared movement, isn't it? And, shared breathing, that sense of ritual of doing the same movement. We know that, when there are some scientists at Oxford University found that when people move together in synchrony, 4 things happen. 1, they report liking each other more. 2, they trust each other more. 3, they feel more psychologically similar to one another in terms of their values. And 4, they're more likely to show pro-social behavior to each other. So that sense of whatever the movement is, whether you're doing Morris dancing or whether you're doing, yoga, then when you're doing that shared movement with one another, you have that social change that occurs.
And is that the sort of mirror neuron stuff that's firing off and getting us in a sense of connectedness with each other?
Yeah, some of that is, we're in a shared space. The social connection, some of those were found originally was an increase in opioid production. Oh, okay. So what they found was that when people were synchronizing their movements, they had an increase in opioid production, which led to a reduction an increase in pain threshold. So they didn't feel so much pain. And there was an increase in social closeness. So when they measured social closeness, even amongst people who didn't know one another, you got there. But the trigger might well have been the opioid production.
Because fundamentally, we feel safe in the herd. I mean, that's how we're designed as social animals, isn't it? So that is a safe place. Fascinating. We're coming towards the end of the show, and I want to make sure that people understand the type of work that you have on offer at the moment and how they might be able to get in touch with you. So you've mentioned a couple of websites. You've got 3, I think, haven't you? You've got your personal one, and then there's also Movement in Practice and Move Ashore. Tell me about both of those. And so Movement in Practice, you talked a little bit about with Darcy, is it? No?
Oh, no. So Movement in Practice is our educational area. So we run courses on the psychology of movement and how you can use that movement in either the workplace or in education or in healthcare to enhance people's lives. So that's the educational area. Give me a practical
example, say in a healthcare setting. Do you mean a class, or do you mean you're going to teach movement for the general staff population? And how does that work?
Well, it could be both. It could be both of those things. So it could be, in a health setting, it might be for people with Parkinson's or with people with anxiety or depression, or for people with rheumatoid arthritis. It's about thinking about movement as part of their medical journey, and including that as a kind of fundamental part rather than as a side add-on. But also then thinking about it in a business setting. So we might work with organizations who run call centers, for instance, and thinking about, how do we help people maintain their health and well-being as part of the work setting about movement in occupational workplace movement and in education
and before
settings.
People poo-poo this, I want to point out that I've got to watch that every certain period of time will flash at me and say move.
Yeah.
And will stop harassing me only after I move. Literally.
Well, it's the thing is, I'm not sure, one of the things we're thinking about is changing the way that people move. So getting them to think about a broader vocabulary of movement. And so if you're sat at your desk all day long doing the same, understanding what the implications are of that, and then giving them a vocabulary of ways they can move without breaking into a full-on jazz dance routine to some groovy music, but thinking about their movement. So we call it movement in practice rather than dance in practice, because it's about movement, which all of us do every day. And it could be tiny movements, it could be bigger movements, but there's a range of movement. So it's about increasing people's movement vocabulary and thinking about the benefits of that in different settings. Right. And then the other thing we do, which is kind of linked to it, that's the Move Ashore. So Move Ashore is a project with Dame Darcy Bussell, and it's called Dance for Mental Wellbeing Programme. And what we have there, there are two elements of it. There's a dance element. So we've got a series of 60 dance sessions, which are progressive. They start off really simple and easy and engaging, a bit like the Couch to 5K for dance, really. Starts off really simply, and it builds up over 60 sessions to get more challenging for people. And then running alongside that, we've got a whole range of well-being tips and toolkits that people can develop during during those 60 sessions. And then we also run mental well-being coaching sessions where people can talk about, engaging aspects of well-being in their lifestyle, which runs alongside it. So we have the dance and movement, which is all run by Darcy, and you'll see me and Darcy dancing in those things, which is great. I mean, I get to dance with Darcy Bussell, which is amazing, and you can too. And then Lindsay, who's
I'm signing up tomorrow, I promise you. I'm off.
Oh, do. And then Lindsay, who's the therapist, runs the well-being and the coaching side of things as well. So, and what we're doing with those is then applying those in either for individuals, and we're also as part of an employee well-being program. So employers can take this program and have it as an offering for their staff. And we did a big project with the NHS last year, and we gave it to 6,000 people in the NHS and social care organisations to use.
Wow, amazing. I'm putting holding on to your caveat about none of this stuff cures cancer, because it doesn't. But nevertheless, it is quite clear, the evidence is quite clear that being in a state of well-being does help physical health. Yes. Okay. Well, when I was first diagnosed, the doctor, after my colonoscopy, said, look, for what lies ahead, you need to be as fit and strong as possible. And the evidence is absolutely clear. People who are fitter and stronger when they go in for surgery, cancer surgery, spend fewer nights in hospital post-operatively than people who are less fit and healthy. We know also that being fit and healthy, people who are more physically active live longer than people who are less physically active. Some GPs did some research on this and have reported this, and this is well established. We also know that dancing can lead to all kinds of positive aspects associated with not only your mental health, but your physical health as well, cardiovascular health, a whole range of things. And we know that dancing can lead to a reduction in some of the symptoms of Parkinson's. Yeah. So yes, dancing and physical activity is really important. But after I had the diagnosis, a load of people wrote to me and they said, you don't need any medical treatment. You don't need drugs. You don't need surgery. Positive thinking will be enough to shrink your tumor. No, it doesn't.
And I was thinking, you might believe that, which is great. I'm not saying you shouldn't believe that, but I don't believe that. And I don't want my book, The Dance Cure, to be perceived as something which is saying...
No, absolutely not. No, I'm with you. And you're not. It's not being perceived in that way here at all. But it is important for us to advance our knowledge about the relationship between the psychological and physiological. And actually, it's a false division. They are not separate. They are the same thing. And an emotion... To underscore this point, an emotion is a neurochemical response. It's fundamentally physical. And the neurochemicals you have in your body, you want them to be happy ones. I promise you, folks, if that's what you want to be generating, is health and happiness from within. And that's available through the sort of stuff that you're talking about, Peter. It really is available,
Yeah. Well, if you think about, I remember going to nightclubs when I was 16 and 17, and I'd walk into a nightclub and you'd hear the boom, 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 you'd hear the music, and you go through the doors into the main dance area, and there'd be lights flashing, and oh my word, the euphoria! I didn't drink at the time; I didn't drink alcohol, and I could dance till 3 o'clock in the morning at the Pink Elephant in Southgate, and I would just be in a state of euphoria.
Yeah,
and that trance, like the euphoric state you get into, and it's entirely natural. The natural high you can get through dancing is just phenomenal.
Absolutely. Listen, we have to stop there. You don't go anywhere. I need to say goodbye to people. That's it for this week's folks. I've had such pleasure talking to Peter, and it's sort of real memory lane stuff for me, but also reaffirmation of some of the fundamental truths of life. Wasn't it Churchill said during World War II, something along the lines of, somebody came up to him and said, well, we need some more money, let's cut the budget for all the arts and close down all theatres. And he said, if you do that, why would we want to fight?
Yeah.
It's like, that's right. Life is bereft without this stuff. So we have to finish there. It's been wonderful to have you on. I'll see everybody next week with a new amazing guest who I don't know who it is. There is a guest booked, but I can't remember. That's the way it is with me. See you all next week. Bye-bye for now. You stay there, Peter, and I'll see you all next week. Goodbye.